We walk around the world which surrounds us nearly every day listening to familiar sounds. We hear the faint tone of people speaking, using words to create sentences within a language. Why are there so many ways to say hello or goodbye? More importantly, why are individuals sometimes judged on that sole criteria, their dialect, their vernacular, their way of speaking? Different societies, different cultures, and different people have unique ways of communicating, but the prejudice and discrimination which attaches itself to it begins to create a separated community. It is time to confront our bias.
Language.
Vernacular, language, prejudice, bias, dialect, discrimination, vernacular, language, prejudice, vernacular, dialect, discrimination,
Discrimination,
language,
prejudice.
We work with different kinds of communicative disorders. First of all, we work with articulation, which is pronunciation of speech. Then we work with language. And language is broken down into three different parts. First, semantics, which is the meaning of words and word relationships. Syntax, which is the grammar. And pragmatics is the use of the language. So we work with articulation, we work with language, then we work with fluency, which is stuttering. Most people know disfluency as stuttering. And finally, we work with voice disorders. That's when you lose your voice or you have a hoarse vocal quality. So there's a variety of different kinds of communicative disorders that we work with.
When I have a client, I look up case history, that kind of stuff, and see if they've had therapy in the past. But I'm going to do an evaluation. And for basic assessments, I will take either a language sample or a speech sample. And I basically have the child talk to me, or whatever client, whatever age, it doesn't have to be a child. And most of the time I'm recording their speech, and I'm also making notes on my own. And that's when you basically get an idea of what kind of sounds, what kind of language processes are going on, and get an idea of what you need to do. If I have a child and they are taking their R's out of their speech, or their S's are lateralized, they're lisping, that kind of thing, I'm going to think, okay, this is either articulation or phonology. This isn't a language disorder. It's in the language area, but it's not language processing or language usage, pragmatics, anything like that. So then I decide what kind of test I want to give them.
Now let's take a ride and discover a scientific basis for our speech and uncover information on dialect and vernacular.
Is it a learning disability or is it something psychological? How we've been taught is to look at the brain and the way the brain, works. And what we have is the central nervous system. You're probably studying this in class as well. So we have the brain and the spinal cord. And there's the peripheral nervous system. It takes all the messages from your senses and it sends it down the spinal cord to the brain. And then the brain actually responds to all those messages, okay? And in order to do that, you need neurons, and you need neurotransmitters. That's where you separate it. Is it a speech language problem or is it a mental health issue? Well, is there damage, or are they predisposed genetically to a certain area, like recalling names, or is it a mental health issue because there's not enough, chemical interaction occurring?
If I had a client from a different culture, I need to take into considerations about that. For example, if I had a client that spoke an African American vernacular, I need to make sure that I'm not taking off points for things that are due to his or her dialect, not because of a language disorder. A difference is not a disorder.
Wait, did you catch that?
A difference is not a disorder.
In other words, just because someone comes from a different country or speaks differently doesn't mean they have a learning disorder. Got it? All right, one more time.
A difference is not a disorder. If I have a client and she doesn't have R sounds, and she's deficient in other sounds as well, I need to think about what I want to start with in therapy. And a lot of the times I'm going to look at different things like if this child's name is Ryan and he's calling himself Wyan, I'm going to start with that first because, and he's 10 years old and he doesn't have the R sound. That's going to affect him so much because he can't say his own name. Probably the kids around in his grade are going to be, making fun of that kind of stuff.
Discrimination and bias and prejudice. So that's what we will do today. Why do you come and talk to a psychologist about discrimination and prejudice?
Because it affects people mentally and how they view it.
Okay, it certainly affects us when we are the recipient of prejudice, right?
You deal with personal clients who may have been affected with this firsthand?
I do. Yeah, exactly. I deal with clients who have to deal with discrimination in their lives. Why else? Another reason? In your psychology, have you yet covered the chapter on social psychology? Social psychology really looks at how we behave as people, as a group. We belong to different groups, and we behave differently whether we're individual or in those groups. And so it's a really a study of how the group affects the person and how the person affects the groups. And social psychology is the broadest area in psychology to study. It has a lot of different topics, and prejudice and discrimination zone.
Well, we see that there is a bias towards people with speech impediments and different things, but do you feel that in some cases there's actually a learning disability that's in keeping them from speaking correctly, or because of their speaking impediment they have a hard time learning?
Okay. That's a really interesting thing because if a really good example of this is a child learning English or a person learning English. They probably, if they're in a school and their primary language is Spanish, but they're in a full immersion English classroom, they are now just trying to develop their English skills. So they're already behind from the students other in the classroom. And they are expected to perform work at the same level as the other children in English. So a lot of the times they're behind just because they're trying to work on the language aspect of it. They can't even get to the content. But that's the language in there. It's not their cognitive skills. If you gave that assignment in Spanish and you gave the instructions in Spanish, they'd probably be able to pick it up. I mean, there's sometimes, maybe that child does have a learning disability, but that's a lot of times where people get diagnosed incorrectly. So you need to look at their background, and that's a good example of giving a test in their primary language. So you really do see that.
So it's mostly that they fall behind because of their language barrier that makes them seem as if they have a learning disability, right?
Yeah, I think the language is affecting how they're learning right there. So it's just that barrier.
I know you're wondering, what does a presidential campaign have anything to do with the bias and discrimination against those individuals who possess unique ways of communicating through varied dialects, vernaculars, or simply their way of speaking? Actually, the government has the power to pass programs and policies that give those people the special help they may need, whether through granting funding to schools for more speech therapists and pathologists, or simply advocating change in our country against the negativity that persistently continues. Even a presidential candidate has an impact on the issues and topics we have discussed.
I don't think we should view our children as little test takers. They're more than that. They are individuals with all kinds of interests and strengths and talents. Schools are cutting out music and art. They're cutting out certain other programs that really get kids excited and learning, extracurricular activities. I don't think that's the best way for us to create the next generation of scientists and researchers and leaders and teachers and doctors and nurses and business people. So we're going to get back to talking to our educators. I'll be a president who actually listens more than I talk. So let's get real about our future. What we've got to make sure of is that in this election, we elect a president who's going to make it absolutely a priority for every boy and girl to have the same kind of opportunities and the same sort of. And if we get real about our future and the solutions we can produce, then these children who are here tonight will have the right, limitless opportunity.
How can we change the world or change what we're doing?
Stop prejudice and end discrimination.
Vernacular, language, prejudice, dialect, discrimination, bias.
Vernacular, dialect, bias, discrimination, language, prejudice, bias.